Can countries truly develop rapidly, lift millions out of poverty while maybe sidelining basic human rights and what we'd think of as a fair deal for their citizens? That's the powerful tension we're really diving into today.
Yeah.
We're going to explore this concept of the social contract, that often unspoken agreement between the state and the people, and its complex, sometimes, surprising relationship with development and authoritarianism.
And our mission in this deep dive is really to pull the key insights from the material you've shared. It covers quite a bit: historical context, philosophical ideas, and specific real-world examples.
Right.
We'll be looking closely at a place like Bangladesh, for instance, to help us understand these core ideas around social contracts, especially in South Asia. And we'll grapple with this apparent paradox you mentioned.
Yeah, the paradox.
Where some authoritarian regimes seem to achieve, pretty impressive economic gains, while at the same time appearing to just disregard this fundamental agreement with their citizens.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this idea of the social contract first, starting with where the material highlights a difference between, say, a classic Western view and the reality in South Asia.
Right.
It paints this picture of the classic nation-state, often seen in the West, where political borders ideally line up with a shared cultural identity. Think of it as a place where there's maybe an underlying sense of belonging, shared history, that helps build trust between the state and the people.
Right, and it contrasts that sharply with the South Asian reality, where, the political borders were, for the most part, drawn by colonial powers.
Without much regard for existing ties.
Exactly, without much regard for cultural or ethnic ties. And this resulted in what the material calls state nations after colonialism ended, entities that often lack that deeply rooted, cohesive cultural base you find in a classic nation state.
So you're left with this incredible diversity, ethnic, religious, national, all contained within those imposed borders.
Yep.
And that diversity, the analysis suggests, can provide a less inherently stable foundation for that traditional idea of a social contract, compared to a more culturally uniform nation.
Exactly. And a really crucial point the material drives home here is that every country has its own distinct society.
Right.
Shaped by its unique history, culture, values. There isn't, one universal social contract that fits everyone, everywhere. Understanding that distinctness is key.
And the historical legacy, the colonial institutions, that casts a long shadow, doesn't it?
It really does.
The material points out that because of these inherited structures, public interests in many South Asian governments are often only partially represented. These societies are often hierarchical, divided, and the systems were built on a history of exploitation, which unfortunately creates opportunities for policies that heavily favor small, elite groups over the larger population.
And what's fascinating there is seeing how the very formation of the state, way back when, still shapes the potential for trust and shared purpose today.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit from that broad historical context to some fundamental ideas about what a social contract should look like ideally. The material suggests Western democracies are where we see social contract theories most visibly implemented.
That's generally true, yeah.
But there's a clear caution, isn't there?
Yeah.
Against just, picking up those models and dropping them elsewhere.
Absolutely. The warning is pretty explicit. Simply trying to imitate Western democratic models or their specific social contract structures without seriously accounting for the unique sociocultural context of a different region.
Yeah.
Well, it's highly unlikely to lead to genuinely sustainable development. That difference, that context, it matters hugely.
And this is where the material brings in the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which helps us understand some underlying principle.
Right.
It touches on his view that humans are unique not just in, say, reason or compassion, but primarily in their free will.
Yes. And he fundamentally challenges that idea that power automatically grants legitimacy, the whole right of the strongest thing.
Right. Might doesn't make right.
Exactly. True rights, for Rousseau, demand respect regardless of whether there's physical force backing them up. The material explains his view that if someone imposes their will through brute power, well, you're only obligated to obey as long as they are stronger.
Okay.
And he argues individuals cannot legitimately give up their fundamental rights or be subjected to someone else's arbitrary will.
So, for any authority to be truly legitimate, truly absolute, according to Rousseau as presented here, it needs unanimous consent from the people.
Unanimous consent, yes. And that agreement has to establish the general will as the ultimate sovereign authority.
The general will.
Yeah, that's the central concept. It's presented not just as like the sum of everyone's individual wants, but as the unified will of the people directed towards the common good.
Yep.
When individuals enter the social contract, their individual wills combine to form this collective entity, basically creating a republic. And critically, the analysis notes Rousseau believed laws shouldn't be imposed against people's will.
Not even by a majority.
Not even by a majority or a single ruler. Legitimacy comes from aligning with that general will. He argued this allows society to enforce laws for the common good without actually infringing on individual liberty because, in a sense, you're obeying yourself as part of that collective.
It's a powerful ideal, isn't it? High-minded.
Very.
But then we pivot to this surprising reality highlighted in the material, what it calls the authoritarian paradox. This is the observation that some authoritarian regimes have actually managed to achieve significant developmental gains, lifting millions out of poverty, for example, while appearing to completely disregard that robust social contract we were just discussing.
And this is where the material really digs into the distinction between those liberal democratic social contract theories and the development strategies these authoritarian regimes often use without such a contract.
Right.
It describes these authoritarian approaches as, quote, often misguided, suggesting they might get short-term gains but lack that foundational legitimacy.
The material also points to the recent resurgence of authoritarianism globally. It draws on Henry Hale's work, Patronal Politics.
Yes, outlining traits like autocratic tendencies, corruption, very personalistic leadership, and a heavy reliance on patronage.
And patronage here meaning?
Basically, using state resources and power to build loyalty networks, reward supporters, rather than operating strictly by the rule of law or merit.
Got it.
Hale, as cited, also connects the stability or instability, like protests in these governments, to the specific leadership skills of the person in charge. It highlights that personalistic nature.
And we also see, even in countries that hold elections, a real lack of genuine competitiveness often.
Absolutely. Which leads to these terms you hear, like illiberal democracies or semi-authoritarianism, systems with some democratic features, but lacking the real substance of free and fair competition.
And going way back, the material reminds us the ancient Romans were sometimes skeptical of pure democracy, saw it as maybe mob rule.
Yeah, they often placed a higher value on liberty and the rule of law.
And the rule of law is emphasized as absolutely critical, isn't it, for any functional social contract framework?
It has to be a cornerstone. And the material suggests that by integrating deeply held religious and social values, the rule of law can actually be strengthened. So justice and fairness aren't just legal concepts. They resonate with the moral core of society.
Okay, now let's connect this back to contemporary politics. Challenges facing social contracts, even in, democratic-leaning states. The material points out how some populist leaders, even those elected democratically, can paradoxically challenge the very foundations of traditional liberal democratic values.
This is where it gets particularly tricky, yeah. This phenomenon, the material argues, can inadvertently strengthen authoritarian regimes.
How's that?
While those regimes are often quick to exploit the uncertainties, the divisions created by populist movements to critique democratic governments itself, they present their own model as more decisive or stable.
And the consequences can be pretty severe. Populist leaders, especially in diverse countries, often resort to scapegoating minorities, right? Blaming them for problems.
Yes, and that can lead to persecution and, maybe most dangerously, a breakdown or even collapse of the social contract. It fragments that general will.
And in countries that are more homogeneous culturally,
there, the focus might shift more towards external threats. So prioritizing national security over essential social spending, health, education.
Okay.
And this can create a cycle. Governance declines, nationalism rises, and there is an increased risk of shifting towards authoritarianism because the perceived efficiency of autocracy starts to look appealing compared to the often messy nature of liberal democracy.
And looking at the development strategies of these authoritarian regimes, the material highlights a key vulnerability: their long-term sustainability.
Right.
Specifically, it points to how these strategies often contribute to widening inequality.
We see that pattern historically, in stricter authoritarian states.
And growing inequality, the material emphasizes, doesn't just exist alongside social contract problems. it actively makes them worse.
Definitely. It becomes much harder to maintain that agreement between state and citizens when wealth and opportunity are so unevenly distributed. Creates huge gaps in experience, access.
So, to see the real-world impact of this,
Yeah.
the material brings in Bangladesh as a vivid illustration of a fractured social contract.
It does. It details specific issues observed there, a corrupted electoral process, large-scale disenfranchisement.
Mm-hmm.
And a particularly troubling point is this tendency to conflate the idea of the social contract, the agreement on rights, obligations, with simply achieving development metrics like GDP growth.
Just a number.
Just the numbers. And this conflation, the analysis suggests, allows those in power to exploit people's immediate struggles, their basic needs.
And this is where the human impact is really stark. The material explains that when people lack a reliable way to get basic subsistence, food, shelter, healthcare, they can be forced to overlook those fundamental social contract principles. The most vulnerable might even support figures who seem tyrannical, just prioritizing immediate survival, access to resources from the powerful over their actual rights and governance.
It's a harsh reality. And it unfortunately enables corrupt leaders, those benefiting from the system, to do things like capital flight, moving huge sums of money out of the country, often with no accountability.
Right.
The material finds it deeply troubling that some regimes manage this facade of progress while fundamentally neglecting the social contract. It argues this diminishes the very essence of human dignity and rights.
And it's quite clear, isn't it, that this type of development achieved without that robust contract shows little evidence in the material of having lasting transformative impact over decades, let alone centuries, not compared to more inclusive models.
You see that tension clearly in Bangladesh's impressive GDP growth figures over the past decade. The material notes this growth, but crucially highlights that it's largely overlooked equitable wealth distribution.
So the benefits aren't spread evenly.
Not at all. And this disparity, it argues, reveals a critical weakness in the social contract. Growth alone isn't enough. How that growth benefits everyone matters.
There's also mention of a significant rural-urban wealth gap.
Yes, common in many economically advanced authoritarian countries, which often rank high in global inequality. And rapid urbanization itself creates challenges, cultural conflicts, as traditional values clash with progressive urban ones, adds another layer of complexity.
And the material also notes that the previous administration in Bangladesh was associated with disseminating misleading information.
Which is a major hurdle for building trust. Public trust in government statements and institutions is absolutely vital for any social contract to function, let alone thrive.
So given these huge challenges, this fractured state of the social contract in places like Bangladesh, what paths forward does the material suggest? How do you rebuild that trust, strengthen that agreement?
Well, the core idea presented is that for a social contract to genuinely thrive, you need public trust.
Trust in what exactly?
Trust that government statements are accurate. And, critically, trust that institutions genuinely prioritize the common good over narrow interests, over elite interests.
So governments have a big role here, actively combating misinformation, ensuring policies serve national interests broadly, not just specific groups.
Exactly. The material looks at the ongoing crisis in Bangladeshi society. The divisions, protests, tensions, the risk of fragmentation.
Yeah.
And it suggests a key way forward is embracing inclusive social protection systems and actively striving to build a truly diverse and developed society.
And how would that help with the social contract itself?
Well, the thinking is that implementing inclusive systems, fostering diversity, can help restore trust in institutions, which in turn is vital for social cohesion.
Okay.
This shift, it argues, can create a kind of virtuous cycle. Inclusiveness leads to greater trust and cohesion, which ultimately enhances stability for everyone.
There's a specific suggestion mentioned, too, about local governance.
Yes, for the Bangladesh Local Governance Program Strengthening Social Audits. These are processes where citizens can actually review and scrutinize how local government resources are used, how decisions are made.
Ah, so direct accountability.
Exactly. A concrete mechanism to foster a stronger social contract between citizens and their local governments.
The material also frames national constitutions themselves as vital social contracts. Documents aiming to harmonize diverse interests with society's broader needs.
Right. And it suggests that for a constitution to really function authentically as a social contract, especially somewhere like Bangladesh, it needs, well, an in-depth evaluation.
To make sure it reflects current values.
Exactly, to ensure it genuinely reflects the values, morals, and evolving needs of its citizens. Constitutional initiatives might be needed to resolve controversies and make sure it operates as a living agreement for society today.
And underpinning all of this, obviously, is upholding the rule of law, ensuring due process.
Absolutely. The material stresses these principles must resonate deeply with the spiritual, moral, ethical fabric of society to be truly effective.
Concepts like checks and balances, separation of powers, fundamental but sometimes ambiguous.
Highlighted as fundamental, yes, but the material notes they can be ambiguous in practice and need ongoing clarity to ensure real accountability.
Now, while talking development, the material does acknowledge a correlation. Economic, social, political liberalization often links to better living standards, poverty reduction globally.
It does acknowledge that, yes.
But it also notes critical environmental flaws in many contemporary development strategies that urgently need addressing.
A crucial point. And ultimately, the material circles back to needing to weave moral principles into the very fabric of the social contract for a sustainable future.
Right.
The conclusion seems to be that success hinges on governments being genuinely accountable, responsive to citizens addressing both material needs and those less tangible emotional needs.
Like belonging, fairness, dignity.
Exactly, while actively avoiding narrow nationalism and divisive identity politics.
So when we put all of this together, the history, the philosophy, the realities in places like Bangladesh, the surprising performance of some authoritarian states, what's the core takeaway here?
Well, it seems that while authoritarian regimes might show impressive numbers, economic growth, lifting people from poverty through certain means, the material strongly suggests this often comes at a significant and maybe unsustainable cost.
Which is?
The erosion of the social contract, a diminishing of human dignity, and potentially lacking that foundation for long-term equitable stability.
It really underscores the complexity, doesn't it? No simple formula. Flawed systems can achieve some material gains.
They can. But the fundamental question of lasting impact, true equity, respecting basic human rights that remains central.
So, considering these challenges we've discussed, the widening inequality, lack of trust, divisive politics, how truly fundamental is a robust social contract? Is it just about abstract rights, or is it absolutely essential for genuinely sustainable, equitable development in any nation? What does it truly mean for a society and its leaders to prioritize human dignity right alongside economic progress? Something for you to keep thinking about.